Day webcast sponsored by eDiscovery today, titled Future-Proofing eDiscovery, Challenges and Considerations Associated with Modern Data Sources. Over the next hour, our panel will be discussing several modern sources of data and what you need to know to address them in eDiscovery. A couple of notes before we start. We do welcome questions, and you can submit them via the Q&A button on the right side there, or via the chat button as well. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can over the course of the webinar, and we'll look to leave some time at the end for additional questions. There's a lot of you registered, so hopefully we can get to as many questions as we can. We also welcome your comments in the chat. Let's make this interactive. So certainly we welcome a dialogue during the course of this, because I'm sure you all have observations as a part of these discussions, and probably have your own experiences to share. So certainly, by all means, please do so. Also, please note you'll receive a copy of the slides after the webinar, either today or tomorrow. So look for those. All right. eDiscovery Day has become one of the industry's biggest annual traditions in eDiscovery, thanks to the collaboration of so many partners across the legal, compliance, privacy, and tech communities. That includes ACEDS, EDRM, my company, eDiscovery Today, and other organizations around the world who've made this day an annual event in eDiscovery. Special thanks to Exterro, who started eDiscovery Day in 2015. This is the 11th eDiscovery Day. And that coincided with the publication of the 2015 amendments to the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure. eDiscovery Day was started to recognize and celebrate the professionals driving this field forward, and has continued to host educational sessions and networking events each year since then. So on to our session, and we have a terrific panel to discuss today's topic. And hey, if they're going to make us superheroes, we might as well run with it, right?
Lean into it.
Exactly. So I'm going to introduce them here quickly. Our panel starts with Group Governance, aka Greg Buckles, who is the founder of EDJ Group and the editor of the excellent publication eDiscovery Journal, when he isn't too busy with consulting work. We also have the Forensics Weirdo, aka Jerry Bowie, who is the SVP of Digital Forensics at Purpose Legal, and keeps us all entertained on LinkedIn with his terrific videos. And we have the eDiscovery Wonder, aka Kelly Twigger, who runs not one but two companies as founder and CEO of Minerva26 and Principal at ESI Attorneys, making us wonder how she manages it all. And finally, I'm the eDark Knight, aka Doug Austin, editor of eDiscovery Today, a daily blog about eDiscovery and related topics, and I'll be your modern data, your cold-infused modern data point guard for today's discussion. If you want to know more about us, click on our names when you get the slides to be taken to our respective LinkedIn pages. So here's what we're going to be covering today, and it's pretty simple, as we're going to be spending time discussing these different modern data sources, at least as many as we can get through. Hopefully the last couple don't get Matt Damoned, but we're going to talk about the challenges and considerations associated with them, and what to do about those challenges and considerations. We'll also throw in a few memes from Gates Dogfish to have a little fun, and we'll discuss key recent case law rulings related to each modern data source with the case law rulings provided by Kelly's company, Minerva26. Of course, any ideas expressed by us here today, especially those while under the influence of cold meds, are our own, not those of our organization, clients, or partners, and nothing we say here should be construed as legal advice. Disclaimers are always contemporaneous. All right, and one quick shameless plug warning. The 6th annual eDiscovery Today State of the Industry Report survey is now live. You can scan the QR code, at least I think it works, to take the survey, either now or when you get the slides. And taking the survey will get you the report for free, and the report will be made available free to all subscribers of eDiscovery Today. The bottom of the slide shows you where you can enter your email address to start subscribing. So with that, we'll get into the topics, and we'll start with enterprise solutions and let that sink in for a moment.
I think we're going to see some case law on this particular meme, actually.
Right? Indeed. So let's face it, the rise in use of enterprise software solutions has skyrocketed over the past several years. I looked up a couple of stats, and global IT spending in enterprise software reached over $1 trillion last year. And nowhere has that been more evident than the rise in the use of Microsoft 365, which reported last year 400 million paid commercial users, but there's probably a lot more when you consider individual users. So the total number, I think, is probably closer to 1 billion. And I'm not sure if they really have a reported number. M365 and Microsoft Purview have certainly become ubiquitous in many organizations, like it or not. So, Greg, you work with M365 and regularly stay up to date on changes that might impact users from an eDiscovery perspective. A lot of people use M365's eDiscovery functionality, but many of those users complain about shortcomings with M365 and Purview. So what are your thoughts about using M365 as an eDiscovery solution, at least for left side EDR phases?
Purview is different than the actual kind of 365 data. The reality is to everybody is that, you know, whether or not you want to use 365, if the data lives there, you have to use 365 to get to the data now, period. You don't have a choice. Even if you're using a partner product that is theoretically going through the Graph API to get the data, that's the exact same API that Purview is going through to get it. So when I have clients who say, is it ready for prime time? The answer is, it doesn't matter if it's ready or not. It's what you have. You need to use it if you want to preserve the data and you want to get to the data. The difference is, when can you use it and have a reasonable reliance on it, and can you defend your process? And that has to do with the classic, you know, trust but verify. Just because I have to use it doesn't mean I should be using it blind. Mm-hmm. That's where it gets tricky, because even though you can go back to a magistrate or the other side and say, you know, we missed this because of X, what you want to be able to show is that you put the time and the effort in to make sure you knew where things were, how you should be retrieving them, what the context of the retrieval is. And unfortunately, Microsoft has been, and Purview has been, a bit of a moving target with this, in that they are doing good things. They are investing in developing the product and putting new features in, new capabilities on a weekly, daily basis. I spend a lot of time tracking this and reading their roadmaps and going, wait a minute, what does that actually mean from the roadmap? And it's one of those areas where I know that Jerry and Kelly and I have all spent a lot of time with clients trying to untangle and look at things from a practical, case-specific basis. How do we scope this? What are the custodians using? How do we get it? And how do we make sure that we can review it and produce what's relevant with the context intact, so people can tell what happened on that lovely shared SharePoint page or that loop page or whichever. So the answer is that you don't have a choice. That's where the data is. You're going to have to use it. So you better be an informed consumer and test what you're using and be able to disclose what you can't get to the other side, because that's just as important in that negotiation as saying, you know, I had one recently where we had to come back and say the syntax you want us to use on that criteria is not supported in a way that I'm willing to be able to stand behind and certify. So we're going to have to pull all the raw terms, and these are our known file type exceptions for this tenant and this client, and we're going to have to reprocess a larger percentage than we want within a different platform in order to get the search context that the syntax to work that you want. That's the kind of game we got to play these days with it. Keeps me busy.
And from a legal perspective,
job security, right?
Right.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Sure.
Go ahead, Doug.
Yeah, absolutely, job security. And I was going to say, knowing what it can do and can't do also means rolling with the changes, because in August they rolled out a completely new revamped UI. So what do people need to know about that, and how they can adjust to those recent changes?
Well, remember when Microsoft rolls something out, they don't roll it out all at once. They roll it out tenant by tenant across the globe. So you're never quite sure when new features and functionalities will show up. That's not something that your IT person is going to be able to see all the time, which means that the trust but verify becomes a on-demand weekly setup where you need good quality control.
Mm-hmm.
So the new UI has got some great new features. There's definitely some new things that are helpful to be able to set data sources within a purview case. The export is the area that I would say they've done a lot of work on recently, and that means where you want to test. They did break some things for a couple client tenants and my test tenant on the export. We've had some problems with malformed zip files coming down, either having to redo them or having to find alternative ways to pull the data. I'm sure they'll have them fixed. You file your bugs, you work on it. It is an area where it's getting better, especially the search syntax, but there's things on the horizon. I re-updated my roadmap from there. I basically pulled my monthly roadmap file and looked at it, and they've got natural language again in the syntax. So they want people to go in there and just say, give me everything related to X. If they've done it right, where the natural language gives you back the actual syntax that's being applied, great. If it's a black box and I can put a question in and I can't explain to counsel what terms were actually being searched and what properties, then we're in trouble. That's kind of testing we've got to do.
And that's where I think, I would jump in and say the problem is you've got to be able to justify the court that you've done reasonable searches. And we're going to see that in some of the case law. So that will bear out.
Well, that's the part about all the new generative AI that scares me, is that everybody gets used to being able to just ask a question and just pose it in plain language. But what does that mean?
Yeah, there's a lot of concern. I have a lot of concern about what's going to be reasonable in using those contexts. I completely agree, Doug. I think it's going to be interesting. But I think what's really challenging and sort of the overall takeaway for M365, and it's also for Google Workspace, is you need to know what your client's using, and you need to understand what these problems are and how you're going to address them. And they're going to be unique to each client because they all set things up just a little bit differently. And so you've really got to get in there and understand that. And when a lawsuit is filed is pretty much too late. So if you've got ongoing clients you're representing, you need to learn this stuff now. If you're counsel sitting on here and you're going, well, I don't have an idea how I would do this, you need to either find somebody internally or externally that can help you do that. Several of the folks on this call can do that. So, really get in there and figure that out, because as we're going to see in some of the case law, it's still your responsibility to provide responsive information under the rules.
Yeah, and rather than maybe add to your already existing sense of dread and anxiety when it comes to Microsoft 365 and its unpredictability, I can give you some really practical takeaways. The new interface is combined. It's unified now. So it's known as the Unified eDiscovery solution. There is no distinct eDiscovery standard or premium kind of coinciding with an E3 or E5 license, respectively. It's one thing, but there are going to be differences based on your E3 and E5 license status, and that's all reflected in things within that solution that will be grayed out. And you might wonder, well, I have an E5 license, why are things still grayed out? There's a toggle in the case settings. So you have to go to that toggle. It's one toggle, and you have to activate the eDiscovery Premium settings with your E5 license status. And some of those are very important features that will aid in the thoroughness and completeness of your collection or export from Microsoft Purview, depending on the things that you are obligated to preserve and produce. So note that there is a toggle now. That's something that's brand new. And that if there is a kind of simultaneous forensic investigation that's occurring, you have to go in there and collect differently than just from Purview, right? So Purview would help you with the ESI eDiscovery piece of it. And even though you have things on hold, they don't put the logs on hold. I think that's a major misunderstanding, because the logs will still expire. And so if you're doing an investigation, you have to independently preserve the unified audit log, for example, because those will expire based on, based on certain settings. I mean, generally think about it as a 6 or 9 month or even 1 year status. Let's assume the shortest period there, which is 6 months. If if the important kind of activities or nefarious behavior or misconduct occurred, you'll want to collect that independently. And it's always a good practice to, while you're doing the ESI collection, also grab the audit logs in case there is a investigative component to your case later down the road so that they don't expire.
Jerry, can I ask you a quick question about that? Because I am a big believer in audit logs. And part of the audit log, it's a slightly different logging process, right? But the changes that are made to documents when we get to talking about hyperlink files here in a little bit, those are also created in a log. Are those logs, from a retention perspective, do they have the same expiration that you're talking about, or are they a separate setting?
They have different expirations depending on what you're looking for. And furthermore, IT has to have some of that logging turned on in the first place. So that's also something. And, when IT generally gets into purview, I think that given the relative simplicity of that interface, I think there's a false sense of security on what each of those settings do. There's a lot underlying each toggle, each setting, each checkbox. And so the permutations on the different outputs that you can get from Purview really depend on which specific combinations you choose. And some of them are better to select and some of them are not for ESI collection. So having a playbook with the appropriate settings and workflow considerations is really important for for you and your clients.
Well, and just getting your folks in there who actually understand that interplay between the tenant administrative settings versus the purview settings.
Absolutely.
And where you're going back and forth. I've had clients recently who've come back and said, we did a check and we were by default keeping the old 100 versions of all SharePoint files. We'd like to cut that down. And, we're looking at how many, hundreds of terabytes we can save. But the problem with a lot of that is now we start looking at what are we getting rid of? And, in general, as long as custodians are on legal hold, even if they reduce the versioning, it doesn't matter because I've got copies that are kept. That doesn't apply to our shared hyperlinked centralized files. So if it's in Loop or if it's in Teams, and even if I've got a custodian on hold, is that site on hold? And now if I cut the versions down, it starts coming back on us. We lose data.
Before we spend our whole hour on our one slide, let me just add this one point, and that is that legally you're obligated to produce data that exists as of the time your duty to preserve arises. So, I don't think we're having this webinar to have everybody get their panties in a knicker, but, or knickers in a twist. I'm mixing metaphors, but just these are the things to think about. This is technologically both what you need to think about, but also balancing with what your legal obligations are.
You can definitely go down these rabbit holes and get lost in it. I think that the fundamentals of it is spend the time to look at how your users pre-look before a case. How are your users using the system? What are the settings? Know it. Know your limitations for preservation and retrieval. Things like right now, as of Monday night testing, the Copilot recap for Teams meetings still cannot be preserved or retrieved via Purview. It's kept by the default setting on that team site where it happens. So that's the type of exception you want to make sure you understand, so that you know where you're going down the road and you can properly disclose it to counsel and they know what they're working with. Is it important in some cases? No. Is it important in other cases? Vital.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, we're going to move past that first slide. So we're making progress here. One of the things I've been on, I think this 3 panels now, Jerry, I've been with you on this fall. And every time you've talked about Microsoft Copilot and the artifacts it's creating. I'm not sure this screen is the best example of that, but can you talk a little bit about that and what people need to be thinking about with regards to Microsoft Copilot AI artifacts?
Yeah, I would say make 2 main points here is that the Copilot artifacts as it relates to the document are, I think, lacking. But the Copilot artifacts as it relates to the orchestration, administration, and audit of how Copilot is used within a tenant is very good. Actually, Microsoft has put a lot of thought into maybe encouraging or promoting the Copilot. So they want to, roll out some features that allow you, okay, what's the usage of it within your program, because it's an extra cost. It's more expensive, so they want to give us some insight into how it's used. But for the legal and compliance perspective, we can also see an audit trail around Copilot and how it's used, and it's storing actually Copilot interactions. So the chats that you have with your own personal Copilot are stored within your mailbox, so that you can see the history of what you say to Copilot, how it responds. But once the actual document is generated, so you have Copilot helping you craft some language for it, once it's in there, you really can't see what was specifically added or what parts of the document were collaborated upon using anyone's respective Copilots, right? I think that's the concept there, is that Microsoft wants you to take ownership of anything that the Copilot creates, so it doesn't distinguish necessarily between what you contributed to a document versus what your Copilot contributed to the document.
Yeah, no, great point. And we'd spend more time there, but we need to move on really quickly. Greg alluded to this, but this is if you use M365 or eDiscovery, this is a must check out resource on Greg's site, eDiscovery Journal. Greg puts out M365 roadmaps periodically that address the changes that Microsoft's making, and also their eDiscovery impact. And Greg, I believe you say that these roadmap items eventually disappear off of Microsoft's roadmap, correct? And basically these are the record of it. At that point. Anything else you want to say very quickly about your roadmap updates?
First and foremost, what's important here is that everything there, except for the column that says EDJ and impact, are Microsoft's info. What I've done is basically every month look at the new items, identify items that I think may have impact to our world on the compliance eDiscovery side, rate it 1 through 5, and then add a description of why I think it might have impact and where it might come down the pipe and how you might get around it. So everything there in terms of substance wise, I always say as well is go back to the source. I've got that first column with the feature are hyperlinked directly to the Microsoft roadmap. So you can just click on it and go straight to the map. What I'm trying to do is get through the noise. So like this last one, there was 374 new features and only about 8 of them had any real impact in our world that I felt. That doesn't mean there aren't hidden things in there and there aren't things for your clients or your own tenant that you might want to pay attention to. But it's just trying to make a little, signal from noise on it. We also did have a question on that Purview about them now starting to charge. So if you're loading, Purview just gave you the ability to upload data that's not directly inside of 365. So if you've got local collections, etc., it is, however, a $20 per month per gig charge. So make sure when the little thing flashes up and says, pay as you go, that you know what you're paying, so that you don't get an angry IT person coming back with a bill for you later.
Right. No, great point. Absolutely. All right. And very quickly, M365, Purview, Google Workspace, not the only enterprise solutions to deal with. There's a whole bunch of others, HR solutions, CRM, accounting, BI. I know Kelly and I recently covered a case involving Salesforce data. These are modern data sources that also have to be addressed, and we will see cases involving data from them. So you have to have a plan for those too. And that takes us to the case law. And so, Kelly, did you want me to talk about the first case, or did you want to touch on it?
I don't mind kicking it in, and then you said you had some great content from Georgetown that you wanted to be able to share. So the FTC versus Match Group. Match Group owns Match.com, which many of you are probably familiar with. And they sued them over allegedly unfair practices that make cancellation difficult, right? This was a similar underlying thing to the Nichols v. Noom case, which we had in Hyperlinks. Match produced a whole bunch of documents to the FTC, but then produced 500 documents very late after discovery had closed. And Match told the court that they had had a glitch because they had plugged in an archive software into Microsoft 365 to be able to retain documents for them for purposes of preservation, and that there was a problem with the files. Some of the files weren't preserved, and so they had to go back and do some additional searches. There was a lot of convoluted factual information about Match having other litigations that they were involved in that they had to be able to find the data for, and so cases overlapped. In essence, the court found that Match's description of the technological issues, the reasons for the late production, were sufficient enough to avoid sanctions under Rule 37, but not sufficient to avoid sanctions under Rule 16F1, which is a violation of the scheduling order. And Jug has a lot of factual information to add here, but I think this is really important because basically, if you're going to produce documents late, you could be subject to sanctions under Rule 16.1. Now, the sanctions that were granted here were just to allow the FTC to do discovery related to those documents that were produced late. So it was a very narrow sanction and frankly, a very fitting sanction. But point is, you're really not going to get away with stuff anymore. So all the stuff that we just talked about understanding the technical capabilities, limitations, and features of the tools that you're using, plus the case law, it's tight.
Yeah. I think Judge Peck referred to this as kind of more of a corrective measure, if you will, than a true sanction. But one of the things I really like about this case is I mean, we always talk so often about what parties do wrong. This case really illustrates what a party did right, because obviously, while they probably should have had better QC to understand what what's being delivered in their searches and so forth, and maybe should have caught it on the front end. As soon as they identified an issue with the production, they were very prompt about notifying opposing counsel. They were very prompt about diving in and figuring out what documents were affected over a very small period of time. It was essentially ultimately less than 500 documents being added to a production of already 300,000 documents. So the scale was very small from that standpoint. And I think that's one of the I think lessons learned from this case is being prompt in terms of identifying these issues and addressing them proactively instead of trying to sweep them under the rug. So
I'd like to throw, because Kelly, you said the right word there, which is tight. Tight, normally when I look at eDiscovery, usually I associate with deadlines. And I would like to make the point here that they could have avoided all of this if they had sufficient margin and bandwidth built into their process so that when their quality control came up with the issue, they could have resolved it before the production deadline. And I've run into that recently with cases where clients where the new purview changes rolled down the pipe. We suddenly found that we had export issues and had to find alternative ways to deal with the specific data. But we were able to do it inside of that production cycle because we had the extra couple days, we had the extra time built into our service level agreement that said, give me time to quality control, give me time to go back and look. Let's not run this up against the wire.
Yeah, I'm gonna. Here's the hard part of that, right? Because as counsel, one, we have to understand all the technical stuff, but two, it's our job to communicate. And we're trying to communicate in a way that assures the other side we're taking care of whatever's happening and we're trying to get the information. But it's difficult to be self-assured in those conversations when you don't really know. And having the conversations with the technical people is very hard. Yeah. It's hard even for someone like me who lives in all that technical stuff, right? Because everybody communicates a little bit differently and some better than others. So what I would say is that there's a couple of lessons to take away. One, absolutely what you said, Greg. And two, as counsel, you've got to get in the weeds and you've got to be able to understand what you're communicating. And that, I'm not going to second guess what happened here because I don't know all the facts. I read this one decision. It doesn't have a lot of facts in it. So, but it's a constantly moving target, right? And I think in this particular case, there were two different issues, one that led to an earlier production, one that led to a subsequent production that both totaled 500. One, there was the technical issue with the archiving solution, and there's something else on the other side. The point is communicate. The point is communicate effectively and quickly when something comes up, right? And be prepared to give when you should. And that's what I think Match did here.
Yep, absolutely. All right, I'm going to move us along to a topic that will take no time at all to cover: hyperlink files, because I have nothing to say about that. Here's the meme for that. I put it up early so you all could check it out. And I'm just going to very quickly, we understand that most of you are probably eDiscovery professionals and may kind of understand at least a high level of the issues. I will very briefly touch on this one just to kind of set the stage, but also I'll note that we've talked about the considerations with hyperlink files numerous times. I think I've been on 3 panels with Kelly alone, including last year's eDiscovery Day panel. We both have it in our video archives, and we did a couple with NextPoint as well in EDRM. So if you don't know what hyperlink files and what the big deal is, I'm sure you all know that a hyperlink file is a link to a file in another location, and obviously they've existed for pretty much as long as we've had email. So what's the big deal? The big deal is that the move to the enterprise, to the cloud and enterprise solutions has changed the game in terms of what we do with the files. From a InfoGov standpoint, we are starting to think of not having as much data flying around or multiple copies of data flying around. So more organizations are starting to link to files in cloud-based repositories instead of embedding them in emails. That's great for an InfoGov person because there's less data duplication to deal with. Really sucks for an eDiscovery person because we're dealing with a situation where we don't have the data, a snapshot of the data at that right time. And we may never be able to get it. We may not be able to get to that particular version or even any version of that file at all. So that's the big deal here that we're talking about from a hyperlink file standpoint. And it's creating nightmares from a collection standpoint through platforms like M365, through Google Workspace, and we're even starting to see it in other platforms as well.
Slack, yep.
Yeah, Slack and what have you. So basically any platform that links to files externally is a potential consideration here. So that kind of hopefully sets the stage. And one of the things I'll mention here, and I know that Bigmarker doesn't provide animations, which is a shame because I really like the animations on this one. But I'll walk through briefly. Is that it's not just a collection nightmare; it's a preservation nightmare as well. And in the case of like an M365 example, if you have a custodian named Sarah Davis, which actually happens to be the name of the custodian on their add a custodian to a case documentation, you can add her to a case and put on hold her mailbox and her data stores, her OneDrive, her Teams, her SharePoint, what have you. Lock those in place. Great. You think you're done. And that's fine for any files she sends out, any emails and any files she sends out. But what you're not locking down is any files sent to her from other custodians, which are all those people, all those other data stores with the arrows pointing in. Those are basically being kept with those custodians. And unless you draw a picture around the entire thing and lock it all down and put them all on hold, you're really not fully preserving everything. So these are some of the challenges you run into. And I think one of the things, and I'll just kind of raise this as a question for the group, we continue to talk about custodians, but it seems like the custodial data is becoming more and more diluted. Any thoughts any of the three of you have on that?
It depends on the source of ESI. 100% depends on the source of ESI. Text messages, instant messages, that are one-to-one are still custodian based. But once you hit Teams messages and you start talking about collaboration tools and things like that, and you're talking about channels and Slack, then it starts to become less custodian based. So whether it's custodian based now depends on the source of ESI. And Jerry, I'm really glad you answered Sheila's question because I was going to throw that at you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, Jerry, you're muted.
Yeah, Sheila's question is a good one because it offers a solution, which is, you know, yes, you can grab the modern attachments in both Google Workspace and in Microsoft 365, but it's only the most recent version. And
Contemporaneous. Mhm.
if you want the contemporaneous or point in time version, how do you do that? I think there's a lot of a lot of hand wringing over that. But we're eDiscoverists, and we've been working with MD5 hash values forever to identify a very specific version. Why haven't they implemented a solution based on MD5 hash value? That's a great idea,
Yeah,
Sheila.
I mean, Google puts a reference file. They'll give you a reference file now, and Vault's just implemented that in 2024. Well, they'll give you a reference file, but it's not an MD5 hash, and you've got to write a special script to piece them together. Whereas if you had an MD5 hash, so good idea.
So,
Yeah.
Doug, I'm going to call a what I call a little architectural issue with your slide.
Okay. All right.
Okay, when you look at Teams and SharePoint, okay, and Teams and SharePoint really are the same thing with just a different cover and all the rest of it.
Understood.
They are actually custodians underneath the 365 world. They are in 365 groups as a custodian name that own it, and each one of those has its own mailbox and its own OneDrive or file location where they're keeping the data. So even though Sarah may own, quote unquote, or have membership in various team sites, SharePoint sites, they're not automatically locked down. You're going to have to go find them, and you're going to have to lock them down. And on every person in your outer ring who's kicking stuff in and out, it is the custodian. When you say the custodianship is being diluted, it hasn't really been diluted. What they've done is create artificial custodians that are these group names that you've got to go out and find in order to lock it down there. It's the source. That's why you're not being able to preserve those copies, even though I've got a list of 20 or 30 custodians on hold. It's those other locations that get tricky through there. And it gets worse when we start going into loop and other areas. But my main point here is architecturally is that Microsoft has already created essentially entities that are custodians from a hold perspective. The architecture is the same for a team site as it is for an individual site, for a person. So I've got a mailbox, I got a SharePoint there. That's where the copies are stored.
Okay, great point. Thanks, Greg. Case law here. I'll touch on NRA UberText. If there's one case you really read all the decisions from to get a sense of the variety of issues associated with hyperlink files and a court's handling of those in a really methodical way, a comprehensive way, this is the case you should check out. I linked to 3 different case rulings here. The discussion about I think Judge Cisneros coined the term contemporaneous version, which I think a lot of us have adopted as using the point-in-time version, if you will. The case has progressed with a lot of issues being discussed. Ultimately, a compromise in terms of providing so many per week and hyperlink files and what have you. It's a really good progression of the issues and parties working through those issues, and the court working through it with them. So I think that's a case you want to check the various rulings of, because there's several of them that really give you a sense of the issues at play there. Kelly, you want to talk quickly about the Carvana case?
Sure. The Carvana case was a securities class action case, and there are multiple discovery motions about whether Carvana needed to produce Google Drive documents that were linked in emails. As they existed at the time, the emails were sent, so the contemporaneous versions. And essentially, the court said, you guys need to work it out. You got to come up with a sampling plan. And so here, take a couple of custodians. Let's see what you can do. The plaintiffs in that case were advocating, I think this is the right case, we're advocating using forensic email collector, which is a tool from Metaspike. And that may take us to the Armand podcast. But and so the Carvana was arguing, no, we can't use FEC. It's not going to work. Here's why. And the court said, well, let's try it. Let's try both ways and see what we get, and then come back to me and talk to me about it. So very much following and even citing Judge Cisneros' rulings in the NRA UberText case. In Carvana, it's really the latest decision on hyperlinked files that is really substantive. So it's a good one to read.
Yeah, agreed. And to me, I think the statement that stands out in it, that is quoted in there, the court will not excuse defendants from any efforts to produce contemporaneous hyperlinked documents outright simply because they elected to use a suite of cloud-based web applications that would make that process difficult. So that's the first case I think I've seen where courts have really established an expectation of you kind of have to figure it out.
That's true, Doug. But I will say Judge Cisneros because Google Vault is what Uber was relying on. And Judge Cisneros said, look, you picked Uber Vault. You knew Uber Vault didn't allow you to do this. That's what you picked. You still have the same responsibilities you have under the rules. And that's been consistent, since even 2006, when we started talking about cloud-based services. That's been very consistent. So it's an extension as to hyperlinked documents, but it's consistent with courts in their rulings.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. I know Uber uses Google Vault extensively, but I still think they probably call it Google Vault. But all right, mobile devices. We're moving on to a new type here, and let's face it, we admit it, we've all done that. So all right. Moving on. When it comes to mobile devices, obviously they're the modern data source that everybody loves to hate. We love their phones so much that we can't imagine parting with them even for a short time, so that important evidence can be collected. So, Jerry, as a digital forensics professional, you regularly see the considerations and challenges associated with mobile device collection. So, what are some of those that our audience should be aware of?
Yeah, where should I start? I think probably the two biggest factors in collecting phones is whether you should do them remotely or in person, because now those options are available. And it really depends on the nature of your collection. Again, I go back to, is this a ESI collection where you might be able to do this remotely and do filtering and then, run your productions accordingly? Or is it contentious? Is there a investigative component? Do you have to use the best available approach in order to prove that you've preserved it according to the best industry standards? So while you can collect text messages remotely, if you're talking about full-blown preservation, you're going to need to have that done in person, whether an examiner travels to the custodian's location or those phones are sent in and into the lab, into the forensic lab, so that we could do a full file system, which is the best version available today. So there's a couple of software suites that accommodate that. So those are the two main things. I think from an enterprise perspective, we often get stuck with factory reset phones, even though the user guide says that there might be an obligation to preserve. If they're BYOD, then there's a lot of personal information commingled on that device. So they kind of justify it by just factory resetting it. Or they have Apple IDs that are personal Apple IDs, even if they're corporate issued. And that that will prevent us from getting a full-blown image of the phone or a full file system. So there's, a lot of considerations here that really depend on the make and model of the phone, the iOS or Android version of the operating system, and even the app versions, right? And whether they're actually stored on the phone or in the cloud or a combination of both. And with the synchronization nature of cloud today, how can we recover deleted items? If you can't get it from the phone, can you look in the cloud for backups? Can you look at other synchronized devices? All of those things are true, but so many things to consider when it comes to the mobile devices, as the data source for collections.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. One of the things that is coming into play more and more is BYOD devices and who's got possession, custody, control of those devices. Kelly, we've covered a couple of cases, 2 or 3 over the past couple of years relating to that. What are your thoughts about that? And what should a organization do if they have employees with BYOD devices to protect themselves?
So that's a lot to unpack in one question. The answer from the perspective of, does an employer have possession, custody, or control over an employee's personal mobile device, has a lot of layers to it. And the courts have, in the federal courts, specifically have looked at two different tests of the legal right or the practical ability test. What's been really interesting over the last 2 or 3 years is that we found a lot of rulings that are just requiring employers to provide that information with absolutely no analysis whatsoever of the legal right or the practical ability test. In my view, both of those tests are pretty outdated in terms of modern technology and in terms of trying to apply them to mobile devices. But we've seen a number of decisions where judges, it's almost like they make up their minds as to what they want to do, and they pinpoint all the facts into that answer. The Allergan versus Revance case that is on your next slide that we talked about at RailFest is kind of one of those in my view. United States District Judge Xavier Rodriguez and I are writing an article for the University of Florida Law and Technology review that'll be out, I think, in February on this particular topic, and proposing some different ideas about different tests that we could perhaps look at. But I think a lot of the things that Jerry just said in the BYOD policy issue is some of what courts need to start considering. There almost need to be a bunch of factors that courts look into, because what does your BYOD policy say? Is there also an employee manual like there was in the Allergan case? Can you marry the two together? What if your employer says you can't use WhatsApp, but you're using WhatsApp and everybody knows you're using WhatsApp, and everybody at the employer and even the person who wrote the policy knows you're using WhatsApp? Does that matter? Because we've seen courts that are like, well, there's a policy. And so, is in the fundamental fairness question under the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure that both parties should be entitled to the same information. You have to reconcile that fundamental fairness with all of these difficulties. And this possession, custody, or control is an area that is very fraught.
It pops up all the time on policy questions when I'm in with clients who are global, because I'll see policies written that are North America centric that say nobody can use external ephemeral messaging applications. So no WhatsApp, no Signal, no all that stuff is off. That's great until you are overseas. And when you're overseas, what we hear back from the ground floor, from the business professionals, is that doesn't work. We can't do that. Everybody here, if I want to communicate with the government, if I want to communicate with my contractors, with my purchasers, all these things, all of that is done on WhatsApp or Signal or one of the other platforms, WeChat, you name it. And that's the only way we can do business. And so now the company is stuck in the crossroads of this. Well, you brought your own device. You're using your device to do business. You're engaging in this platform that our policy says you can't use, but we have to let you use it because you have to do your job. And the eDiscovery people, we're coming in behind this in the middle of this firing squad between the two going, can I please just get the messages relevant to this particular scope on this hold? I don't want to look at the rest of your device, but I do need that.
Yeah. And my view is I would still preserve. And then if you want to make a legal argument about whether or not you're required to produce, but if you preserve and you have access to those devices to be able to preserve them, haven't you met both the legal right and the practical ability tests?
Potentially, but I would point out here that and this comes back to Jerry's earlier about what you can preserve and how you preserve it, you have to be very careful which methodologies of preservation. Some of those companies that promise full, selective collection still have to do a full preservation to the local before they selectively retrieve out of that. And you had it, even if you...
That's a whole different topic, Greg. I mean, I agree with you, but that's a whole nother topic.
Okay.
Well, one thing that you had on the previous slide that I definitely want to mention during this session is the embedded AI that's on these devices nowadays. Be very careful. A caveat to all forensic examiners for doing analysis around nefarious behavior, and you can find a lot of behavior as it relates to the cell phones, right? Because it's your life essentially, and it tracks a lot of things that you do, almost everything. So the one thing there is that when you have these embedded artificial intelligence agents now, they go through and they sweep the data on your phone and they impact the metadata. So something that I found recently is that modified dates are being changed on some artifact categories. And so if we jump to the conclusion that those are the user, it's not necessarily the user, it's the AI. And so now we have to really untangle whether or not it's the the operating system that's making the changes to this metadata, or the user, which has been something that we've had to sort out. Now we've got a third category, which is it the operating system, is it the user, or is it the users,
Can
or
you
is it
know
the
that, Jerry?
AI?
Can you tell that? Is there something in the log files or something in the artifacts that tells you that?
We're still looking. So as it relates to the iOS contacts, we were able to find out it was the AI. So we had saw all the modified dates for contact entries updated at the same time. And for this particular custodian, who was a sales director, it was initially interpreted as by the opposing expert as exfiltration of that Rolodex, or that contact information, customer information. But when I looked at it a lot deeper, we found out that it was actually Apple Intelligence going through and doing its routine scan of the data, and it was what was updating it. So that is an evolving area for sure.
Wow.
So something to be aware of. Don't jump to
Yeah.
the incorrect conclusions when it comes to this metadata analysis.
On a related point for going back to your file shares is on Microsoft's roadmap, Copilot's going to be able to essentially share out their Copilot summaries of files directly from when you're in File Explorer, just clicking on items. So we don't know yet whether that's going to change modified dates or where those are going to reside fully, but it's another area of Copilot kind of crawling across your live system and generating things that are changing the metadata.
eDiscovery by design never exists in these products, just saying. It's always considered after the fact.
It's so funny that you say that, Doug, because I think that's a really important point for everybody. And that is that the tools that we use to create, store, send, and receive information are not designed for eDiscovery.
Yeah.
And there is no ROI for the companies who are designing them to build in eDiscovery functionality, because as soon as they do, they're going to get pummeled with people asking them for information in the same way that Meta and Google and everybody gets pummeled, right? So they're not going to do it. So it's up to us to create technological solutions. And that's why there's such a great legal tech startup community and trying to solve these problems for people, which it'd be great if we can share, right? So as you're finding something, share it with us if you want to, and we'll make sure that it gets out to more people, because we have to work together and almost do what we do in being a community to solve a lot of these problems.
All right. Yeah, absolutely. 8 minutes to go, 4 categories left. So I figured the last couple were going to be tough, but I'm at least going to get into the second to last one. Chat, collaboration, ephemeral, excuse me, ephemeral apps. A lot of issues here. I'm going to try to limit us to a couple of minutes, which is way under what we can talk about here. But very quickly, what are some quick takeaways that if we're going to do a 2-minute roundtable, I'll start with you, Greg. What are some very quick things that people should be thinking about with regards to chat and collaboration apps? And
straight up, reconciling or making sure that when you bring this information into your Discovery platform for review, that you have aligned your communication fields, because all of your analytics and AI and the rest of it are dependent on essentially the entities and the people, so that whoever the identity is of the person who's chatting, you want to make sure that those fields align so that your searches work. I've run into problems recently with where we were bringing in data from multiple sources in chat and multiple versions of chat, and the other side producing their versions with their fields. You've got to really stop and step back. Email, we get complacent with it as to how we import it, and whatever your format you're importing, stop, look at the fields, and make sure that when it arrives in your review, that your review is going to work right and your search and retrieval will work right.
Great points. Jerry, your thoughts?
The way that you unitize these chats into document transcripts matters. These are subject to searches, and so what happens to things that fall outside of the search? The context can change. I'm also worried about the review of these things. And when you, I don't know why the word is slipping my mind, when you black out an area
Redact.
of
Redact.
Thank you. So when you redact these chats, are they being redacted in the typical way that documents are redacted, right? Or are they just disappearing off of the transcript? And so again, I worry about context for these transcripts because they're constructed from individual messages. That's my current anxiety, a current problem I want to answer and solve.
I think those two problems are downstream from what I consider to be my problem, which is how do I actually figure out what I need from these various applications to be able to respond to discovery requests. And it's very difficult because every single one of those applications that you have listed there handle information differently. They display it differently. Their collection from them is all different. So you have to have a plan for each one of these sources of ESI, or you need to have somebody else who has a plan that you can implement, and you need to stay on top of what are the latest developments to allow you to do it better. I mean, Signal doesn't store data on the device it's sent from or to. It's only in the cloud, so you can't actually collect it, and Signal's not going to give it to you. So you have to, create something really creative, and it's very hard.
Yeah, and it's we're trying to, as we always do, try to force everything into a document paradigm when this data is very undocument oriented, it's message oriented, and so we have to keep that in mind as well.
I just want to add one other thing, Doug, and that is that now that, so there was just a recent announcement that as of maybe it's January, Facebook is going to start sharing all of your messages on Messenger with its AI to train it. And so the question becomes, right? Somebody raised this earlier about deposing Copilot. The question becomes is when your information is shared with AI, are you waiving privilege, right? These are the sorts of questions that we're going to have to start addressing.
Yes, the meta approach of share first, ask questions later.
Right.
So, all right. Actually, since we're running short of time, I'm going to skip the case law on this unless there's anything pressing, Kelly. You think?
No, I can add the links for people if you want.
Yeah, the Pavel case is particularly. I mean, it's a terminating sanctions case involving Signal messages, and a discovery of mobile device. So it was a very interesting case.
They're both really good. You should read them both.
They're both really good. Yeah. Well, one of them, the first one isn't a very good decision, but it's there. So, all right. Generative AI content. Very quickly. There's our meme for that one. And let's face it, we all feel like it sounds like we're saying Forrest Gump's Gen AI when we're saying it. But to me, I think this may be the biggest one yet, ultimately. In terms of the next frontier, because we have so much content from Gen AI chatbots. We have shadow AI all over the place in organizations. ChatGPT, according to OpenAI, handles over 2.5 billion prompts daily. Obviously, we have AI-generated images that are increasing and videos and what have you, increasing considerably. One thing that is really blowing up is the summaries from AI meeting assistants. We're seeing that all over the place. I think somebody at Georgetown a couple of weeks ago said they have a client who's generating like 100,000 meeting summaries a day, huge organization, and they're basically creating AI and all that's data that could eventually be discoverable. So these are things to consider. And then, of course, behind the scenes AI content like code, synthetic data, internal docs, and so forth. Any quick thoughts about this particular area and what we should expect here? Kelly, I'll start with you first.
I think it needs to be on your checklist now of what are the ways in which you're using AI on a daily basis. It needs to be part of your custodian interview. It also, as you identify all the sources of ESI, you need to be thinking about how AI can be used on those. And that can be a quick chat or Google search, what AI can be leveraged or what AI is built into these products if you're not familiar with them. And then, yes, absolutely, the summaries are going to be discoverable. I think the question becomes, who are you going to use to depose about that summary, right?
Yeah.
Meeting attendees, et cetera, and do the summaries include those? So I'll let others go because we're short on time.
Okay, Jerry.
Yeah, remember that on the evidence stream, synthetic media isn't just audio and video. I think that's the most sensationalistic use of deepfakes, but they could also affect other run-of-the-mill documents as well. So whether they're contracts or things like that, you can have AI effectuate, some fraudulent information in those, like fraudulent signatures, or nowadays, if a fly-by-night company or a shell company that's being used nefariously needs to show documentation around the substance of the company, like you can have Gen AI create all of those things overnight, the policies, the procedures, all the meeting notes and all that stuff. Just do it fabricated. There's so much fabricated documentation that we need to worry about, or that we need to be paying attention to in case they cross our case, in case they are introduced into our cases, and hopefully you'll be on alert for those things so that you're not having fraudulent information used within your case in an improper way. So the duty of care really matters here.
Yeah, more job security for forensic investigators like you, right, Jerry?
And don't forget that OpenAI is currently having to preserve all of its non-deleted chats in the OpenAI.
Oh no, that's been they've had to they've agreed. They have a joint stipulation about a month ago to waive that. So now they're not having to preserve them all anymore.
Oh, that's good. They narrowed it. They finally narrowed it. Good.
Yeah, in May the court ordered them to do that, but then they were able to stop as of last month. Greg, quickly, your thoughts as I go.
On a straight practical basis, you go in and you talk to your custodians is great, but before you go in and talk to your custodians, go into Purview, do a test case, create a search, type equal Copilot, date band it. Let me see the last 2 days. Let me see the last 3 days, depending upon where we have things, and look at what you're finding across the company. Because right off the bat, I've walked in and they've said, no, we're not using X, we're not using Y. And I go in and run the search for it and pull it back up and say, look at all these document summaries. You've got this whole group of people who have turned this feature on and are getting automatically, when they open every Word doc or they open every PDF, they're getting a Copilot summary that is stored and I'm able to retrieve at this point. So it's the trust but verify. Know what people are using, in part also by what can you look at from the backside.
Yeah, absolutely. Very quickly, a couple of other types. We won't have time to talk about them, but audio, video files, structured data is becoming more and more of a regular data source in cases we've covered. I've covered 2 in the last month or so. Those second and third bullet points are there for those. And the first case actually is a audio video that happens to be a hyperlinked podcast file, which is a very interesting case, which we had time to talk about it. But we're already 3 minutes past, so let's not go any further past. So I don't see any other questions or comments that we haven't already addressed. So I'll say a big thank you to Greg, Jerry, and Kelly, and all of you for joining us. eDiscovery today, thanks also ACEDS, EDRM, and especially Exterro for their support and promotion of eDiscovery Day and eDiscovery education in general. If you'd like to catch more sessions or watch anything on demand, head to eDiscoveryday.com. And thanks again for being part of this global celebration. Enjoy the rest of eDiscovery Day. Bye, all.
Happy eDiscovery Day, everybody.